Very good afternoon, dear learners and RC. Welcome to this session, which has been specifically arranged. Uh, this session will discuss block 3 of DCE 5, uh, which is dealing with the. Yeah, very good afternoon, very good afternoon. Which is dealing with writing poetry. And this particular block is dedicated to the themes, to the structure, to the various other devices to write the poetry. So we are here in this block 3. In block 2, we discussed the how to identify the theme, and as far as the blocks are concerned, they have the different topics under them, and the block 4, 5 specifically to discuss the structure. But within this structure, there are a number of other sub areas, and we this morning we discussed particularly the themes. What are the areas that we can think about choosing them as our themes? And then we also discussed a very important aspect, that was the development of the theme, where we answered two questions, where and why. And then we also discussed as to what goes into making the unity of impressions, means how do the impressions gather, accumulates, and then make an intense situation where it erupts, and that is the point which is the climax in a poem. Similarly, we also briefly discussed the end of a poem, which can be having different approaches, such as rounded ending, closed ending, open ending, likewise. So all these are primarily the strategies, the policies, the initial tips for writing poetry. In this particular session, we will discuss a couple of important issues, and there will be questions, there will be answers. So the very first block, the first unit of block 3, which is to discuss the structure. In this particular, we were talking about the design. Then we discussed the development of the theme, the climax, and that was this morning. So block 3 is primarily for two things, two very important tools, which are called the literary tools. Those are imagery and symbols. It is very important to note down here, as far as the creative writing is concerned, that the literary tools, literary devices, those are very important, because they are helpful in pinning the ideas into some image, because image is very important. If image is not created, the poetic communication doesn't take place. So image or is very important. Imagery is a very important device, and so is the symbolism or the symbols. One very moot question is, how does poet speak to the audience, or to the listeners, or to the readers? How does one speak? How does the poet speak? The poet speaks through the personae we discussed. Then that personae is It's a kind of situation where certain characters, they create a situation, and then an image is created, and then image is voiced through suitable words where language plays a greater role, and then it is related to a symbol which is a concrete object outside the poet's world. So this is not within the poet's world, but it is in the real world outside. So it relates to that. That means it reaches the audience. So if we talk about this particular block, which is imagery and symbols, then the very first unit deals with the symbols. What do we understand by symbols? So symbols, what symbols are simply signs. They are devices to denote something. Those are simply devices to denote something. Something is indicated if somebody says it's very hard as rock. That means the person is very strong. Person is very strong-willed, and person is without too many sensitivities, or he lacks a kind of poetic interest. Like I used the word this morning, a very important metaphor, which is Saridai. So a rocky person cannot be Saridai, whose heart is like a stone. He will not be able to appreciate poetry, so that's called stone heart. But nobody has a heart of stones. That is also a fact. But because we call somebody who is not very sensitive, who is not very, stimulated by poetry, then we call him stone heart. So this is the stone heart is the symbol. The person having no interest in poetry is the image, that kind of image, and then stone heart is the words which have been used, and then who is saying this thing, that depends upon the person. So this is the story that we are going to discuss. So first we will discuss what are the symbols, or what is the symbol. So I told you that symbol is just a sign. Symbol is just a hard object in the outside world. In the real world, I should be using in the real world. So it is a device to express the in level of feelings in a person, level of intensity in that particular object as regard to image which has been created in the poet's consciousness. Symbol, is not meaningful in itself. Stone heart saying this doesn't make any sense. But if someone say he is as cold as stone heart, like this, so then that would mean that a symbol becomes meaningful if it draws, its meaning, which are on the conventions of the language, uh, as well as its power of suggestion. So saying stone heart doesn't mean anything. It becomes meaningful when somebody says he his response to poetic recitation was very cold as a stone heart. So response is to poetry recitation, that is act, and there's a situation. So in that situation, if somebody doesn't react, that means she is a stone heart. If we go a little beyond this discussion, uh, then we also understand that a symbol is poet's conscious or unconscious transference of his personal meaning. If somebody says he's Stoneheart, as cool as Stoneheart, as big as elephant, or charming as fawn, you know, deer-eyed, like this. There are so many other forms also which are described through the symbols. So, but they become meaningful only when the poet, or poet's consciousness, means poet's intention that is there in the image is transferred to the outside world. So that is his personal choice, personal preference. Means the poet might not like to symbolize a person who has a very cool response to poetry to Stoneheart. He might say he is very cool, he is very unresponsive. So then unresponsiveness is also having the same meaning, but the choice of symbol is prerogative, sole right of the poet. So, in order to describe a beautiful lady or a lady with beautiful eyes, one can say, uh, just like no, the face is just like moon. So, like in Hindi, we have a word Chandramukhi. Face is just like moon. But one also can say Sumukhi, very beautiful face. Or somebody say fawn-eyed, like this. For uh, Swakshi, or for uh, having very beautiful eyes. So it is the choice of the poet as to what symbol is to be used. The biggest advantage of the symbols is that poet it helps the poet to in his attempt to bring poetry as close as possible to the condition of the you know condition of the musicality of the symbolism. That means what symbolism, what sense of object is attached to the symbol, that becomes possible only which the desire of the poet, because the poet wants to attach very refined meaning. So if symbol is also representing that very deep understanding, deep meaning, then that is possible. Symbols in poetry, poetry is in profound manner is symbolic. Without symbols, or without being symbolic, there will not be any poetry. That is the innate quality or innate characteristic of poetry. So, to say that poetry continues to be profoundly symbolic. So, you similarly, if we say hungry people, hungry people. So, if we are, if it doesn't make much sense in the poetry. So, we can say he is as hungry. The wolves are chasing the or one can say like deep blue in the deep drowning in the deep blue eyes of the lass, drowning in the deep blue eyes of the lass of ocean. So here somebody if is infatuated to another lady, and then it is suggested he is drowning in the sea, in the deep sea. So in the deep sea of what? Of the eyes. So it is very difficult to compose, write a poetry which is not profoundly, which is not, one must say, almost invariably symbolic. So it is symbolism or symbol is very important device with the poet. One thing which my friend had asked this morning that how long or how short a poetry should be. So, technically speaking, there are no hard and fast rules for determining the size of the poem. It depends upon two, three factors: the theme which has been chosen, the meaning, completion of meaning which the poet wants to communicate, and thirdly, its metrical order. If that permits, then it can go on, go on. Very long poems have been very popular. But if we look at haiku style poems, four lines poem are also there. A sonnet has to have 14 lines. So, except these broad kind of rules, there are no very straight-jacketed rules for the length of the poem. Of course, four, five stanza. I mean, there are if some poems are couplets, so there can be 10 couplets, 15 couplets like this, or there can be small set of lines, 4 lines, 5 lines like this. There can be 8 sets or 10 sets or whatever it is. Sometimes it is poet's own will and wish how long even a small set of line group should be. So, except sonnet and haiku, there are no very strict guidelines. One very important point that I would like to make here with regard to symbols. You see, symbols are actually related to image, and image is something which is unexplicable because it has to be symbolized, only then it will be becoming explicable. So, if we see in poetry, what is poetry? Poetry, like music, it doesn't, it is not gross, it is not a vague activity, it is very emotional activity, like music. It also conveys feelings. So we call symbols as language of emotion. So poetry is the communication of feelings, idea. It's not even idea; it is feelings, and we all, express happiness, sadness, frustration, and achievement, satisfaction, exaltation, depression, all. So all that is that makes ground for the poem. Uh, the language of emotion is to create an image and then relate that. That means you have image. You means you have consciousness or the contents in the consciousness. So they will create an image. So how to attach that to symbol which is in the real world or in a concrete form? So there it is just like symbols are basically, because symbol speaks the image, they convey the image. So symbols are the in a way concretization of emotions. So symbolization is the communication or language of emotions. So this has to be, now we understood the symbols. Symbols are signs which are present in the outside world in various forms, and then they represent the real outside world. And in fact, we get connected with the poet gets connected with the audience only through symbols. Symbol helps to build a connection. Uh, if we look at the the image, so the vis-a-vis symbol, I said they are in the real world, outside world, but image is within the conscious or the consciousness of the poet. So the idea, the experiences are accumulated in the form of image, and when it is connected to outside world, it is symbolized, means then it gets related to symbol. There is one small example. It is Stevens quote. Just before that, I would like to put one small illustration. If somebody is very cruel, somebody is very unkind, then we say, oh, he is like a wolf. He is a wolf. But he is not a wolf. He is not an animal. He is human being. How do we say he is a wolf? So we attach the sense of cruelty, sense of violence to, because we want to describe that this particular person as very violent and very once say very painful kind of attitude, or very intimidating attitude, or very insensible attitude. He is very violent, and so we say he is a wolf. So here the image is of a person who is not very friendly, who is not easy to be approached, and who he lacks patience, like this. But how do we describe this image in the consciousness? Wolf. So wolf is an animal known for cruelty, known for very violent behavior. So wolf represents cruelty and unkindness, violence. In image, we have a situation we want to convey. So the image is complemented by external world symbol. So there is a very close relationship between symbol and the image. Image gets meaning to the, or it becomes meaningful to the audience only when it is conveyed through, or it is metaphorized through the symbol in the that exists in the outside. So wolf is not, a man is not a wolf, but he is a wolf. So that means he is very cruel, very unkind, very violent. So this image of violence, being uncruel, relates to the real world only when there is a symbol. The paper is whiter for these black lines. Very typical example. the paper is whiter for these black lines. What it means? It means somebody having something, somebody, say for example, A is having something, A is having something, but there is a statement and that A does, I mean, it is to convey here that A doesn't deserve what he is having or she is having. So look at this example. The paper is whiter for these black lines. The lines are black always, no? And those are always on the white paper. But means black lines should not be on. I mean, they do not represent the same kind of tranquility as the paper which is white. So they are always there on white. Just to add to this metaphor, to add intensity and then create an image that this paper does not deserve this kind of lines on it. That means it is not worthy, it is very rough paper, it is not writable. So that's one thing. Uh, will symbols can be found in a highly subjectivistic environment. What is highly subjectivistic environment? Uh, we have the objects which represent emotional situations. Flower, a beautiful flower is there. It can be compared with a very smiling face, rising. Sun can be uh, associated with growth and progress. So a sensitive poet will always find his symbols in the real world, which is full of pleasure, pain, achievements, uh, apologies, and nostalgic conditions, and so symbols. What are symbols? They derive their passion from the power from the passion. Passion means all the symbols or symbols do not describe the same meaning to everyone in every situation. In different situations, symbols can convey different meanings also. There is a passion behind the symbol. So symbol is passionate means it has innate desire to reflect multiple meanings as per the situation. Uh, there is an important aspect of uh, in this in this relationship between image and the symbol. So symbol represents the real world, image represents the conscious state of mind. But it give the meaning is given to that state of mind or the state of or the unity of impressions that is given by the meaning to it is given by the symbol which is existing in the outside world. So symbols represent a very important aspect of poetry. That is the beauty of the poetry. Means if there are not symbols which represent the aestheticity in the world or in the symbols which are outside in the outside world, then poetry will not be real joyful or I mean, purposeful. a thing of beauty is a joy for her. So that means beauty, poetry is a beauty. It is for all times to come. So, if a thing of beauty is a joy forever, what is the thing of beauty? Poetry. What is joy forever? The pleasure that is drawn from the poetry. So, what is this joy? Can somebody explain this joy? Very difficult. This joy is actually the experience. This is the rasa, which is drawn from the poetry by listening, by reading, by viewing the or by poetry recitation or whatever form poetry is presented. Then the Sarida who is in the audience, receives a kind of very uh, satisfying feeling. That is, this feeling is called rasa. So poetry is innately supposed to be beautiful, and it will be long lasting, and the recitation would uh, ultimately uh, end in conveying very satisfactory feelings to the audience. So this satisfaction is the rasa. This cannot be described by any gross word. It is a very rasa is a rasa. I mean something which gives pleasure, which gives ultimate enjoyment to the audience. Uh, uh, Something which we would like to know specifically refer with regard to the images. That images are basically the very moot cause of all poetry. If there is no image, poetry cannot be there. So we have to understand that though there are different images which are portrayed in poetry as well as in the prose, so there are different images we see because the plot is different, the treatment is different, the role of characters is different. There are certain characters in the prose, but those characters are not as those uh, which are defining the personal. Now we come to the metaphors. You see, the metaphor is something like like a simile, something like simile, which is based. Simile is kind of comparison between two dissimilar things. Simile is is some kind of attachment of meaning to thing which is not exactly same, but it is just like. So the word just like is very catchy, is very tricky though. It says just like, sense of similar, but not very similar. So it is a sense of similarity between the two things which are dissimilar, which are not similar though. So the traditional meaning of metaphor. What is metaphor? Metaphor is a kind of something that brings about the that brings about the that talks about the point of similarity between two dissimilar things. So this is metaphor. This is there is we assume something. We do not say something for sure, but still we say, because if metaphor is not there, there is no communication. So to communicate, uh, to distinguish between two things, there has to be two things which are not alike, yet through metaphor they are stated to be alike or similar, but when a comparison is drawn, there is slight distinction between the two. So metaphor, is a kind of condition in a poetry, which is the evocation of connotations. Very important. Evocation of connotation. It leads to a situation where a lot of connotations can be drawn. So it brings, it creates a situation. A metaphor creates a situation between two dissimilar things where a lot can be said about they are not having similarities. So it is just like simile. It is just like simile. Uh, Basic there's a distinguishing the two, or understanding two separately. One has to remember that though simile and metaphor seems alike, they're not really alike. They're not same. Simile is something which joins two separate entities. You know, two separate entities, just like a beautiful lady and a lotus flower. So they are joined by simile. But a metaphor is something which in a way it identifies, but it is not creating a similarity. So simile joining the two separate entities, it joins. But metaphor refers to only, it doesn't put two together. So it is not, it is a kind of fusion of two objects to make a new one to some certain degree, but it is not entirely, it is not entirely joining them, but making a sense whereby two are different, yet their fusion is, or they are infused in such a way that they get the meaning of image communicated. So simile is very important, just like we discussed already, that like metaphor is one very important device. Simile is one very important device. Epithet is one very important literary device, like this. So there are traditional and the modern metaphor. So what is the difference between traditional and modern metaphor? So we see that in the traditional metaphor, the objects which have been assigned to them, they establish likeness between life and stage. Life and stage. Stage means how the his real conditions are. Stage is, this world is a stage. This world is a stage. So the way things are here on this world, that is one aspect, and to attach it to attach it to life is another aspect. So when it happens, it is a traditional role of metaphor. Uh, but if that is not the story, then the modern or the latest concept of metaphor that it is to 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 take some image and to put it in the central concept of the poem, to take some object and then put it in the central theme or the concept of the poem. So it is not very clear, like it is again a mixture, traditional and modern metaphor, because traditional metaphor looks at this world as a stage play, and then it brings likeness between life and this stage play. But whereas the modern metaphor, it trains the idea, the image, to the central concept of the poem. So we look at a small piece of poem, like I like to see it lap the miles and lick the valleys up and stop to feed itself at tanks and then prodigiously step around a pile of mountains and supercilious pier in shanties by the side of roads. Look at a great element of traditional and modern metaphor. In shanties by the sides of the road, this metaphor is very important. You know, while it is very highly conventional, it is highly modern as well, because shanties are is a modern concept of jhuggi jhopdi, or the people who are in poverty, their tattered houses. These are found only on the roadside. So this is something which is a good example of the modern concept of metaphor. So this metaphor conveys the uh, modern state of people living in very crumbling houses, very tattered houses, and then a quarry pare to fit its sides and crawl between, complaining all the while in horn, hooting stranger, then chase itself down the hill. Now here, if you see the comparison, is drawn between the shanty's life and then something which is not very clear. So this is a life situation, life stage that a lot of activities happens. Uh, Despite complaining, despite crawling between the different stressful conditions, different. So this is a world view, and putting it in the center stage, and because this is the truth of life. So this truth of life has been associated with the reality of life, or the stage play. So there are different types of metaphors, like complex metaphors and symbols and the conceits. There are varieties of metaphors. So if we take metaphors as a literary tool, then the author is, or the poet is free. It is poet's prerogative to use any metaphor for any type of meaning, but there has to be, rational in choosing the metaphor. But what metaphor is chosen? If somebody is uh, if somebody is so the poet wants to explain or bring up distinguish between a very beautiful lady and a flower, then somebody can draw a flower which is like dahlia. It is never compared with a beautiful face. So usually daffodils, lilies, and certain other like rose. So the face is always compared with that. But there is a fact that a rose or the lilies, though they are different from the real human face, yet the element which is common in both, that is the beauty. So just to bring that stage play of the real world to the life situation, the metaphor is very helpful. So, the varieties of metaphors uh, help the poet to make to write more creative poetry, to bring in the composition lot more shades to it. So it is basically in the modern poetry a lot of other stylistic elements, which which can be called metaphors or conceit or like one is very important device which is being used as metaphor is the personification or metonymy or synonymy. These are also the varieties in the metaphor, but like personification, it is that is a rupaka, what we call in Hindi. So something is personified in moon. The beautiful face is personified. So these are various varieties of metaphors. So, sometimes we use the contemporary, concept of metaphor. Contemporary concept of metaphor is conditions, and the means for the evocation of, certain other associations which are central to point, which are the which have some resemblance to the poem. These days, you see, if you look at the poetry, it has a lot of such issues which are independent. So, in order to bring a kind of conditions where they are all conveyed through the image which is built in the poetry, so there are many metaphors in the contemporary poetry. So, the role of metaphor is basically that way, having a lot of varieties. So it is also believed that metaphor does not, it is not merely, recording the resemblances or the identification between the two different elements, but it is also a linchpin. Metaphor is the linchpin uh, between what? Between two different objects. So it is not only a comparison, it is also a connector, linchpin. I think all of us know. It is a connecting rod, and it is a connecting rod which has a security lock in it. So this security lock is very important because it doesn't allow these two to wave or to scatter and go away from the central stage of the poem. So that way, the modern poetry, which is having lot many metaphors, is feared to have wavered from its central core, but a metaphor very strongly not only compares between the two, yet it keep them together and keep them together in such a way that as good as in a locked manner means doesn't allow them to disintegrate. So uh, uh, important point here is that image is also uh, a metaphor. Image is also a metaphor. How? I mean, because image is created in the consciousness or the conscious mind of the poet. So the metaphor is also, in a way, gets emanated in that particular stage, or the poet applies the device of metaphor in that particular stage where the image is in the building, that is in the conscious mind or in the consciousness, and later on it gets related to the symbol, which is the outside world reality, and then it is conveyed to the reader. So small set of phrases by Shipmar. Everything else is the same. The fluent locomotion of a swan on mute waters, insurgent breasts chained with silver crosses. Here, the poet is talking about what is not very clear. Yet, it it's the modern metaphor or modern concept of metaphor is working. That means there are ladies who are having silver uh, chains on their neck, which are hanging. Similarly, like which is the fluent locomotion of a swan on a mute water. Now, this is another metaphor: swan on a mute water. What is mute water? Waters which are very stable, and the fluent locomotion of a swan. The swan is always swimming, so that means the water should get disturbed, agitated because of the fluent locomotion. What is fluent locomotion? That is very sharp swim by the swan. So on mute waters, what do we mean by mute waters? The water is not able to resist, or it doesn't have its own voice. Insurgent breasts chained with silver crosses. Now this is again another shade. This means a young lass, having silver ornaments on it. Just like a similarity is drawn, just like when the lass will walk, there will be movement on her breasts, and there will be movement in the silver crosses which are hanging or dangling, but nothing will be reacted by the lass. Just in the same way as the water doesn't react even while the very agitated swan swims on its chest on the water itself. So you can see there's a very strong connection between the two, yet the two are very, very different. This one or that might have knelt before the sons of man and burnt him to ashes, but the river has changed its course. What is it? Some episode must have happened in the history Now the time has been passing ever since. It is continuing its journey. So things must have happened in the past, but the simile is drawn between the this one or that might have knelt before the Son of Man, who is the Son of Man, and burnt him to ashes. Who has been burnt to ashes? The man, the Son of Man, and people might have knelt before him. So this means that here was a king. When a king was powerful, many people had bowed down before him, but now he has been killed or reduced to ashes, and time river has changed its course. Now time has changed. That means the king who once was very powerful, uh, people used to bow before him. He has been killed. Now situation is different. Now he doesn't. I mean, there is no terror of that particular king. So this is the meaning. So if you look at the metaphors which have been used, like Son of Man, like ashes, like might have knelt before him, but the river has so this river, particularly this river metaphor, shows the journey of time. So it means time has changed. So while there are two different metaphors, there is a very strong bond between the two, and the word used earlier, it is a linchpin between the two distinguished two separate things, or the between two distinctions. So it is a linchpin, it keeps them together. So sometimes we also see a metaphor as an analogy and contextual notations. Analogy is something which draws parallel between the two things. Like about Colossus, about Gandhi. So if parallel is drawn, that is analogy means we give example of somebody to describe our theme, to describe our image, because the metaphors are the product of emotions and poetic values. Metaphors are the product, means how do metaphors come into being? Those are because of emotions, feelings, ideas that emanate in the conscious mind or the consciousness. These are poetic, poetic vibes. These are poetic stimulations. So sometimes we not only draws parallel, but we compare it with something, and then we say, this can be quoted, as to describe this particular notion. So if we like, there's a small piece of a small set of stanzas that is to describe about the personality of the Gandhi. The multitude waiting to be born, batter under his tortuous steps, we have burst open his blood to bleed. This is something, if something is murdered, that reminds us the murder of Gandhiji. So, that way we can see that analogy can be drawn, example can be given, or something can be described and compared with something that is not similar. There is no similarity, but yet both have certain elements of similar value. So if we talk about bloodshed, we indicate the murder, we indicate the killing. But bloodshed or bleed or this kind of violent act is associated with this personality. So that is a kind of analogy, that is a kind of example. So analogy is something like example, not exactly example, but it denotes a situation where two must have some common element which is very securely connected by the metaphor. So, in modern poetry, the metaphor implies a kind of transactional activity between the context. It helps the image to give its clear meaning, which is otherwise implicit. So the metaphors are very important and significant as a literary tool, and of course it is all prerogative of poet's own psyche and vision, how the poet uses them, what similes he gives, what mm, how he personifies the metaphors, and what language he uses, because language is also a very important aspect in this particular genre of creative literature. So we see the realities of this universe, which becomes a rational. Means in poetic diction also we see that there is a idea of rational universe. Means poetry is not irrational. Poetry is not irrational. It can be irrational beginning, can there be, but as such, poetry is not irrational because it deals with the rational universe. The idea is qualified as relating to the rational universe. So we have seen that there is a discussion about the world play, world stage. So world stage is the reality. All those things which happens in the world stage are the happenings in the life. So it is in true manner. It is an idea of the rational universe. So metaphor helps to uh, connect the uh, image that is created, but it might not be rational. That very point, it becomes rational only when it is related through symbols with the outside world. So the metaphor and image uh, are two conditions which exist in the conscious mind or the consciousness of the poet. So these are not very similar, yet quite a good level of affinity is found between the two. So, dear students, we will move to the last part of our discussion. In poetry, what is to be taken care of? What is important that it shouldn't have? You might have heard a term that is cliches. Cliches. So cliches is something that repeats the same thing without making sense. So the statement becomes very complex. It is reinstated but becomes very unclear. So in poetry, this element with the beginners, creative writers, the poetry writers, this is a very big issue. So in cliche, it's a black knitting of expressions or phrase. It is a problem which takes the which takes the meaning and repeats it, and it makes it more complex then. So cliche is more appropriate in the journalistic writing, journalistic writing, because there are certain sentences like हवा ने बारिश ने बिगाड़ा मौसम का मिजाज. The rain spoils the joy of summer. The rain spoils the joy of summer in Pahalgam. So what it means? People have come to Pahalgam in Jammu and Kashmir, and they would have thought to enjoy the summer there, but suddenly the rains comes, and then they spoil the joy. So it is fine as far as it is in the journalistic writing, because journalistic writing is something which is very complex. It is very simple, very plain, yet it need to have certain such metaphoric uses of language which makes it full of cliches. It is an ornament in that situation. But in poetry, this is a disaster. In poetry, your meaning cannot be hackneyed. It cannot be what I should say plundered. So one budding poet should avoid the use of cliches. For poetry, cliche is to be particularly avoided in different sections of the poetry, because that will not allow the linkage between the different metaphors or different relationship between image and the symbol. So cliche is a twisting statement which sometimes can be a good device, but like particularly like irony, like contrast. When somebody talks about, well, God only knows what the future holds, how it unfolds, and many years it took to rebuild what was lost long ago, like this. So, in ironical conditions, one might use simple form of cliche, yet, as if possible, it should be avoided. So the problem is that cliches must not be at all adhered to. Ornamental poetry, like till recent times, was definitely the original form of poetry had never encouraged the use of cliches. It was freer from the cliches. So we will understand that cliches are not desired for poetry, because the hackneying of the meaning, that means the plundering of the meaning, is not viable, is not acceptable in the poetry. Cliches, the problem with cliches again is that it can end the poetry at any point of time, which might be an abrupt end to the poetry, because it will hack the meaning, and this hacking or hackening of the meaning will bring an end to the poetry. So the later part will not connect with the previous one. That way it will be sudden break, sudden jerk, sudden gap. Cliche, what is the cliche? How do we know? If we use the word hackening or a hackened phrase or an expression, so that will be conveying that it is a stereotype. What is stereotyping? Means looking at something which is very, very conventional. So that means It is using some literary term which is inevitably suggesting something which is, you oft repeated, which is often repeated. So what I have been telling to you is the hackneying, which is the repeating of meaning through the words. So this was a convention, a stereotype in the conventional writing, but in poetry this is not desired, because the once expression is made, it cannot be, you know, backneyed. So backend means it cannot be repeated, and it cannot be stereotyped. So once what we feel, we listen to some piece of poetry, poem, we have feelings. If it is re-heard, re-seen, then that experience is lost. So it is very important that cliches are avoided in the poetry to save it from losing its shine, losing its charm. So in poetry, there are a lot of types of cliches which are found. So maybe we can discuss them in some other occasions. But one example that I would like to quote where cliche can be used to a limited extent, that is the irony or the contrast. But it is a very serious use of cliche to make the situation clear. This example perhaps will be good to quote here. There was such speed in her little body and such lightness in her football. It is no wonder her brown study astonishes us all. Her wars were brunted in our high window, but now go to bells to say we are vexed at her brown study, lying too primly propped. So here, if we look at the speed in her little body and such lightness in her football, so if we look at the use of cliche, lightness to her football, speed in her little body, it is no wonder her brown study. So this makes no sense actually here. So it should have been avoided. It could have been, it is no wonder her brown study. It could have been avoided here, and instead simply the state of the person who is being depicted, the lady, uh, her status of various organs could have been described. If we look at a little more seriously, the cliche in the it has been used in the Oriental poetry also, but not very much. But in Oriental poetry, we see the use of language slightly different. The mediocre poet usually get caught, and the good poets generally transcends from the cliches, from the use of cliches that is found in the Oriental poetry. So maybe avoiding cliches, in fact, shouldn't be a parameter with every poet, because some poet can very intelligently can use cliches to heighten the or intensity of the meaning so as to give it more intense climax. So if we conclude this, then we find that cliche is something repetitive expression, or it is a repetition or of an expression or a phrase. So it is devastating, or it is deviation from the uh, piece of poetry which is in composition stage. certain forms of writing, just like journalistic writing, it is quite useful because it is used in a huge way, where the speed is needed. So the cliche words can be very useful there because they will put the situation in the real perspective and describe it in more intimately, more, I should say, grossly, because in journalistic writing, things have to be made clear on their face values. That means on the words itself should be enough to explain the situation. The audience need not to go into interpretation and drive out the meaning. So cliches are good there. Like somebody says he was driving like the car was being driven like an airplane, and it ultimately met with an accident, and some people lost their lives. But in poetry, it cannot be like this. In poetry, an image has to be created, then it has to be voiced through the appropriate use of language, that means words, and then it has to be symbolized with something which is in the outside world. So we can say that cliches should be avoided, particularly in important and significant parts of the poem, because otherwise it can bring an abrupt end to the poetry. So at the same time, it shouldn't be obsession that some creative writers should avoid cliches in all forms of writing. So one should think of poetry, poems only. There it should be avoided. Certain poets have loved using cliches, but particularly in the Oriental poetry and the conventional poetry. But in the modern poetry, perhaps these cliches are not used to that extent anymore. So, putting a small recapitulatory note to the today's discussion, we can say that as far as the symbols and imageries are concerned, uh, symbols are the language of emotions. They brings the emotions. They explain the emotions, because in external world, when emotions are attached to the realities, to the real hard objects, then it is the symbol, and describing a symbol is describing the emotion. So symbols are the emotions, language of the emotions. Symbols and emotions both are part of the poetic devices, literary devices, and the use of symbols and images is a sole prerogative of the poet or the author. We also know that symbolism is intimately associated with imagism. Means when we imaginize the ideas or the experience or feelings of feelings that are there in the poet's mind, then they become images. So we imaginize the feelings, and then images or the imaginized feelings are symbolized. So that process is the symbolization. So beauty and the rasa is a very important aspect, because the whole story of symbols and the images uh, exclusively rest with the person who is having taste, who is having an attitude or sense of appreciation of beauty. So, if one can appreciate the beauty, there will be rasa. That means if one can appreciate the Image means the feelings of poet which are there in the form of image. Then one can enjoy the poetry to a greater extent as compared to the others who have lesser degree of sense of appreciation of the pleasure derived out of poetry. So, if we look at the uh, symbols, imagery, then if we look at the images, so images is very much or very it is imperative to any literary creation, particularly with regard to the poem. Uh, Prose has different set of images, whereas poetry uses the images slightly differently. Sometimes, the dominant image gets fused with the structure of the poem and thus become an integral part of the poem. So that means the image cannot be separated from the poem itself. It is an integral part of the poem. We also found out that imagery calls for the putting connect between the innermost resources of the language. This is very important statement that about the imagery. When image is created, it has to have very apt and commensurating set of language, set of words, commensurating language to convey the imagery, means to convey those elements which have created the image. So we can only say that image is very important, almost imperative to the poetry, and it is an integral part of the poetry. So the symbols, simile, and metaphors, these are all interrelated situations, interrelated devices of literary works, and all these symbols, similes, and metaphors, all these are almost not synonyms, but these are quite similar in their approach. If there are symbols, those are real hard objects of the real world. Then if a parallel is drawn, comparison is drawn, that is simile. And simile and metaphor have quite close association with them, because metaphors are also uh, are something which creates situation to do comparison. So, we also understood that imagery is structured. There is a series. There is a chronological development in the creation of images in the poet's consciousness or poet's conscious mind, and then it is also related to themes, because themes give the foundation for the images to be built, and very intimately the language describes the images. So imagery is an important part, an important component of the poetry writing or the poetry itself. So we also discussed about the metaphor, and finally the cliches. Cliches is, as we mentioned, it is the repetition of an expression or a phrase, and it is almost killing to the poem. It can bring about an abrupt end, though there has been very conscious application of or use of cliches in the Oriental poetry, though in the modern poetry it is hardly used. Cliches are the forms of writing which brings about more speed and also perform as a tool for detailed communication, which is not preferred in the uh, poetry writing, but it is preferred in the journalistic style of writing or in some other forms of writing. So we know that cliches uh, should be preferably avoided, uh, particularly in the areas of poetry or the poem, which are central, which are dealing with the core themes of the poem, and also on aspects where it is creating a significant impact on the listeners or on the audience. So we can also see that cliches must be used only in such writing that is needed to make it more expressive and more interesting in terms of information, in terms of description of an event or a situation. It happens in poetry also, but then not the way it happens in the journalistic or the informational writing. So some cliches, I mean, paradoxically, has been used in the poetic circle also, but only by those poets who are well versed in the poetic art and craft, who are seasoned. So it is perhaps recommended for the beginners or the early writers, poetry writers, that they may preferably avoid, to use cliches in their poetic compositions. So, dear learners, with this we come to the end of this particular session. Uh, there hasn't been much interaction, many questions, but this morning a question was asked as to what length should be there of the poem. So I think I already mentioned it. Just to repeat it, that there are no set rules, there are no set patterns, except that it depends upon the theme of uh, taken for the poet or a particular uh, poem. It depends upon entirely on that. It depends upon the treatment of the theme, and also in how, in what length the meaning or the scope which was envisaged while writing the poetry was is completed. Except though there are certain short length poetries also, like haiku, and also sonnet, which is having 14 lines in it. So that is all to discuss in this particular session. We will meet tomorrow, and then we will discuss the block 4, uh, which is to discuss about the another area of poetry writing. And this is one block which deals with the language and rhyme. So in poetry, we have seen that a particular kind of diction is used. It is like quality is brought into the writings. Then there is a material structure, and also there is a rhymic method or the making of poetry more appealing to the audience, to the reader, to the listeners. So these four issues will be dealt with in tomorrow's session. I hope we will meet in time and then we will discuss it. So we have two of our learners together. So if there is any question, there is an issue you would like to put forth for discussion.
Thank you, sir.
So I hope your query is answered.
Yes, yes, very well.
Okay,
Very.
thank you very much. So welcome to this clarification. So we'll meet tomorrow, and with this, I conclude the session for today. Have a good day ahead, whatever is left, and then we'll meet tomorrow. Have a safe day, and we meet then. Thank you.